Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Buckeye Weekly Podcast. I am Tony Gerdeman, here as always with Tom Orr. Tom, how's it going?
I think that was a new record. I didn't start counting in my head until probably a second or two in, but I think that might have been a new record. Well done. No more time for pauses, Tony. There is maybe breaking news on the National College Football front that we got to talk about. Tony, it's our favorite time of year. It's conference realignment time. And somehow this just it keeps becoming conference realignment time. Every time you hear nope, that's it, nothing's going to happen, then you get a new report and it's like, well, maybe it's conference realignment time again.
Yeah, this latest one from the Big 12 and the Pac-12 where there's speculation that the Big 12 could be looking to pick off some programs from the Pac-12, the four corner schools, basically trying to get in there and just get them for trying to keep up with the Big Ten and the SEC. Basically, you got to make some moves, and so that's where the latest thing comes from. Colorado, Arizona State, Utah. Correct,
yes.
Tom? Are those the four corner schools going back to my geography B days?
Those are the four corner schools because those are the four corner states minus New Mexico, which does not have a Pac-12 school, and Arizona has two of them. So yes, those are the four corner schools.
If this all happens, New Mexico State, possibly to the Pac-12.
Boy, that would be the darkest timeline if New Mexico State becomes a really. I love New Mexico State football. That is one of my weird delights is watching Jerry Kill try and get the Aggies to a 6-6 record in the Quick Lane Bowl. But man, yeah, that's if the Pac-12 is chasing New Mexico and New Mexico State, that is not good news for the Pac-12.
By the way, did you see Jerry Kill's tattoo that he got?
I did, celebrating the bowl win.
That was a big one. Usually, coaches make tattoo promises. I think Urban Meyer maybe even did it and never came through. Jim Tressel, of course, famously promised he would get cornrows if Ohio State won a national championship, which they did, and then he did, but there were no. I think this is one of those things where you had to turn your cameras in before you. Heck, how many camera phones were even there back in early 2003 at that point? But no photos have ever surfaced of that. But he did it. Jerry Kill, you're thinking, well, it's just going to be this little tattoo somewhere, and it was like all down his arm, and it was a big one. You could not hide it.
Yeah, it was nice work. I was impressed, and it was one of those good for you for following through on that, because that's a very easy thing to say and then not quite as easy a thing to follow through on. So yeah, that was that was a good one for sure. You take those four schools away from the Pac-12, and now the Pac-12 is already the Pac-10 because USC and UCLA are gone. You take those four schools away from the Pac-12, and then there were only six schools left, and I think one thing that let's hit the six schools first. It's the two Northern California schools, Stanford and Cal, the two Oregon schools, Oregon and Oregon State, the two Washington schools, Washington and Wazoo. So those are the six teams that we left in the Pac-12. So at that point, I don't know if you even really have a quorum to hold the league together. I don't know if that's enough to, at that point, the league just sort of splinters, or, because they can add teams. They're talking about adding San Diego State and SMU. So, theoretically, we could be back to the Pac-8 days, but boy, that would be a weird combination of states. And the other thing that goes into that is the reason that this is a time that, if you were going to leave the Pac-12, the reason that this is the time you would do it is because their TV contract is up, which means their grant of rights is up. Grant of rights, this is one of these things you've probably heard about, but grant of rights essentially means when you're signing a new TV contract, you're sort of locking yourself into that conference. And if you leave that conference retains the rights to all of your TV revenue. So if Ohio State decided tomorrow, we want to join the SEC, the Big Ten has a grant of rights until the TV contract is up. So every dollar that came from an Ohio State home football game on television would go to the Big Ten and not to the SEC in that scenario. So that's what a grant of rights is. That's why this is sort of the time that it could be happening. And right now, the Big 12 beat the Pac-12 to the market in terms of TV rights. So the Big 12 has signed its deal, and it was not a hugely lucrative deal. It was kind of low to mid 30 million range per school per year. But now the Pac-12 it just kind of like keeps dragging on and dragging on and dragging on. And you're hearing that, Apple might be involved, and are your primary rights going to be on a streamer, and how much money are you really going to make out of that? And that's why this is all kind of coming to a head right now.
Yeah. And at this point, it would take some sort of rescue operation to save the Pac-12 in terms of, like, if this were to happen, this more charity than profit, profiteering type of thing, because you're not going to get $30 million, $40 million of per team, as there just aren't enough eyes in the Pac-12 in terms of, people watching the games, watching the commercials, being involved. That's why Oregon State and Washington State, kind of like Indiana, Purdue in the Big Ten, you got latched in and you benefit from it. But when you add no other value other than, well, we're also here, and the grant of rights are up, like, you could be left behind. This is where, like, governors get involved, senators get involved. Like, you can't take Oregon without taking Oregon State. But with those 6 teams left, now that leads speculation to the Big Ten reaching out again to, or perhaps for the first time, to expand west again, with the UCLA and USC already being part of this, maybe going and seeing USC or Washington, Oregon, Stanford, Cal. Like, these are all programs. Stanford and Cal, obviously, the academic portion of it, the money that they have, the Big Ten would probably be okay with. The eyeballs, again, for TV purposes and what they're going to be bringing in for that, I don't think is there. Washington, Oregon, it's not there either. So remember, every team that the Big Ten takes in with this current contract, it's going to cut into what Ohio State is making, what Purdue is making, what Illinois is making. All of these teams, because right now the contract is set and it's for 16 teams. So if you start adding more teams, if you add 4 more teams, now you're dividing by 20 and you're taking money out of everybody's pocket. And so at some point, the Big Ten presidents, whomever, have to agree, like, we are okay with this. And that's really, I think, the first step towards reaching out. Like, yes, we would be okay. Instead of bringing in $82 million, if we can bring in instead 70, and these 4 programs can join, like, I think that's the first step that has to happen for the Big Ten, is just to agree to take less money.
Well, and a lot of times, I'm going to cite a source here, Bob Thompson, who is a former Fox Sports executive. He was just on the Canzano and Wilner podcast, I think earlier this week, and he has negotiated a bunch of these deals from the TV side. And they asked him, what do you do with, if you're gonna add teams. So, like, for this example, it was the Pac-12. If they're negotiating a deal right now, and they're saying, and we might add San Diego State and SMU, you're going to have sort of an understanding with the network. Okay, it will be about this much additional money if you add those. It's not necessarily, maybe it's in writing, maybe it's just sort of an understanding. So, when the Big Ten was negotiating with ABC and NBC and CBS, they probably had a similar conversation about that. You would certainly assume that this is not, because this is something that I think Kevin Warren was maybe pushing for more, adding the Washington and Oregon, and the university presidents and the rest of the league were maybe not quite as gung-ho about moving on that. And you'll see various valuations on those 2 schools, but they are not, they are not going to add Ohio State and Michigan and Penn State and USC type TV revenue to your deal. So, it probably will. It's not going to, you're not just dividing the same exact pie more ways, but, on average, you're not going to add so much more that it's going to make up for, adding, sort of below average eyeball teams like Cal and Stanford probably. And then, it's just a matter of what is going to drive this. Is this going to drive, is this going to be driven by purely TV revenue? Is this going to be driven by logistics, where then you've got 6 West Coast schools and they can all kind of play in a pod together, and you can have, they all have a beach volleyball team or whatever, and they can, or water polo team, and they can all just keep playing their own little water polo league or whatever on the West Coast. And when you're flying the women's basketball team. It's easier to, you just back to back Washington and Oregon, whatever trips, and it's a little less travel, and it's not going cross country all the time. I mean, that's, flying from Columbus to Atlanta is not nearly as, taxing on your body as flying from Los Angeles to New York, Rutgers, or, Los Angeles to Newark, New Jersey. Like that's a whole separate, much more expensive deal, much more taxing on your body, much more time consuming. And so just logistically, it might make sense. I'm not 100% sold that this is, even if the four corner schools do jump to the Big 12, what likelihood would you put on it that the Big 10 really does pursue the other four schools? And I will remind you, the Big 10 kind of doesn't have a commissioner right now. So factor that into your decision.
Well, I think they like where they are with their 16. And we've talked about this before, where this season is like a lame duck season, and 2024 is like when everything starts to happen. And as Ryan Day has said in the past, he's like, I would just like everything to just settle for a while before we start doing something new. And I wonder if that's where the Big Ten is, although their hand may be forced. But then I come back to, if the Big Ten adds these four teams or adds anybody else, the SEC is going to respond. And whether it takes some sort of like CIA operation to destabilize the ACC, like that is something that will happen. And now the ACC grant of rights are out until like 2036 unless the conference collapses. So if the Big Ten does something like this, the SEC is going to respond, and they're probably going to end up with, something from the ACC somehow. So should the Big Ten instead wait? And but if they wait, will anything happen to the ACC? Because would you rather have, say, Florida State, Miami, and again, there's a whole AAU thing that we would probably need to discuss, but like a Florida State, Miami, Duke, North Carolina, or Washington, Arizona, Cal, Stanford?
Well, and that's the interesting question. And realistically, it's not going to be Florida State, and it's not going to be Miami. For Ohio, for the Big Ten, it's probably more of the North Carolina, Duke, Virginia, Georgia Tech type schools. And one of the reasons you mentioned the AAU there, we are not talking about the basketball organization. We are talking about the Association of American Universities, or the American Association of Universities. American and Association are, there in some order. And then it's it's the AAU. I think it's the Association of American Universities. And it's basically, it's a university academic thing where it is a network of prestigious research institutions. Every Big Ten school, except for Nebraska, is in that. Nebraska was in it at the time that they were added to the league, and then lost it because of a weird technicality where the university hospital is at the University of Nebraska Omaha and not the University of Nebraska Lincoln. This is all stuff you don't care about. The university presidents who are making the decisions, however, do care about that. It is sort of table stakes to get into the Big Ten that you probably need to be an AAU member. So, Florida State, I don't believe Florida State is. I don't believe Miami is. You're looking more at those sort of mid-Atlantic type schools that would be, more in the Big Ten kind of range, on the Big Ten target list. Miami, Florida State, Clemson, the ones you would just make a purely sports-based decision for, those are schools that are more likely to end up in the SEC. And I mean, did you see, Tony, the Florida State Board of Trustees presentation about how they're upset about TV money distributions? I mean, that's a whole separate. I mean, I promise this is all going to tie together in the end. You're just going to have to trust us on this one. But the fascinating thing was this is like right out in front. This was not a closed session. This was not like this was a message that the Florida State Board of Trustees was putting out there, and it was essentially, yeah, we're worth a lot more than you're paying us right now, and so you should pay us more money. And Clemson sort of, was yelling in from the back, like, yeah, tell them, we agree. And so that feels like that's setting up, well, not that they're necessarily going to be able to get out of their deal at the ACC, but they may be trying to get an uneven distribution where Florida State and Clemson might get more money, a bigger percentage of the TV money, whatever, and that means everyone else has to take less. that is something that the Big Ten has steered away from in the past. Other conferences have done that. Boise State has a deal like that in the Mountain West. I think Gonzaga has a deal like that in the West Coast Conference in basketball. Texas and Oklahoma in the Big 12, they were allowed to keep their third-tier TV rights, which is how they formed the Longhorn Network, and how you got those like weird Oklahoma pay-per-view games once or twice a year when Oklahoma was playing Army or whoever, and you would get these weird games on pay-per-view. Like, what? How is this not on some ESPN channel? Because Oklahoma got the money straight from that, and it was... So they were making more money than Iowa State was or Kansas State was or whoever else. So, I mean, that it feels to me, I don't know why, what is the ACC, what is Florida State's leverage to be able to squeeze more money out of the ACC? Like, we're mad. And the ACC kind of shrugs and goes, okay, well, you still have a contract through 2036. So good luck with that. So unless the ACC completely implodes, which would involve the Big Ten and the SEC probably both pulling 4 teams out, and then all of a sudden you don't have a conference anymore. I think that's going to be, legally, that's probably going to be a tough thing for those schools to wiggle out of without writing a very, 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 very big check.
I don't know if it was maybe like 15 years ago, Carlos Boozer was an up-and-coming player for the Cleveland Cavaliers and was, like the contract was, he was still under contract, but he was like, you know what? I want to sign a long-term contract. Why don't you just like let me out of this contract and we'll re-sign a long-term contract? And so they did, and then he signed with Utah. And just like bolted. I'm wondering if like Florida State and these schools are like, let's rewrite this so that we can at least try to make us more happy. And then as they void this, they're like, see ya, we're out of here. We're heading to Utah. Probably not Utah, but the part of that presentation was showing like what all of these conference teams are getting. And remember, the ACC contract goes through 2036 with ABC. It was ESPN and ABC. It was a 20-year deal, pays them $17 million a year per team. The current Big Ten deal with NBC, CBS, and Fox is going to pay them $67 million a year. So $50 million more a year per team. That's what Florida State is seeing. And they're seeing, like, why in the world is Indiana making $50 million more than us? And Clemson is thinking the same thing. And, the SEC, they'll be, Vanderbilt's going to be making $34 million a year more than Florida State and Clemson. So absolutely, they should be unhinged and angry, but they also all signed the deal and the poison pill of the grant of rights that they all signed so that they'll all just be steadfast and together. And now they're all sitting in their bunker, eating their rations and watching everybody outside partying with the beach volleyball on the patio and, grilling the steaks. And you're like, wish we could be out there, but no, you are bunker babies and that's where you belong. So I don't know how they get out of this.
Well, and the really funny thing is the ACC significantly strengthened its exit fees after Maryland jumped to the Big Ten, because Maryland paid, I think, 1 year of revenue or whatever it was, and it was something in the neighborhood of maybe $25 or $30 million. And so the ACC went, we're going to change our rules. Now it has to be 3 years. So it's going to be, something in the neighborhood of, you mentioned $17 million of the ESPN contract. There's a bunch of other revenue streams. I think it adds up to something in the $30 to $40 million a year range, give or take. But now you have to pay 3 years worth of revenue to get out. So now it's more like $120 million to get out. So that's hurdle number one that you've got to clear, because that is a lot of money you got to dig out of couch cushions. Number two is then you got to figure out the grant of rights issue, because you signed it. So I'm very sorry. Maybe you can cut a deal to get out of it, but what is the ACC's motivation to let you get out for less? Like, what is your bargaining position? Like, well, yes, we would like to pay less money. Okay, why? Well, we'd like to pay less money. Okay, we would like you to pay the same amount of money. Seems like we are at loggerheads here. How to break this? How to break this tie? Who's to say? It is really. That's going to be, I think, the most. That is kind of the thing that's holding the whole thing together right now. It feels like, because if you're going to get if college football is going to really just explode into, the Big Two and the Little Eight. I mean, it's like the old Big Ten in the 70s, except it's conferences where it's the Big Ten and the SEC, and then it's everyone else is kind of like some degree of poor. They're both, the Big Ten and the SEC are both on their mega yachts, and everyone else is sort of like, well, we're kind of, we're lower middle class, and we're extremely poor, and we're Conference USA, and we're just Mr. Monopoly with his pockets out. But you just, if the ACC feels like that's kind of what's holding everything together right now. What's interesting to me, though, is you look at Clemson and Florida State looking for more money. If they get more money, if they get an unequal revenue distribution, how long does it take? That's been talked about with the Pac-12 as well. Oregon and Washington. There was an interview with the Oregon State president, I believe. I think John Canzano did that one as well. The Oregon State president was talking about, the fact that, they're kind of exploring this and do certain schools get more money? So if you're looking at that in the ACC, you're looking at that in the Pac-12, the Big Ten has always been, even Steven, very equal distribution of money. Tony, do you think Northwestern brings as many TV eyeballs to the table as Ohio State? And a follow-up question, how long do you think the even Steven deal is going to stick around for the Big Ten? Is that something that you think might change at some point in the future?
Well, I don't think the Big Ten has never been monetarily driven, Tom. So for you to throw out these accusations and insinuations, in terms of Northwestern, remember, that's Chicago's Big Ten school. So they command the market. But Ohio State, Michigan, as when you have money, you just want more of it. And so when there's all of this money out there, they've done a fantastic job of staying strong, and they're all being rewarded because of that. But people who are rewarded also eventually, I would like to be rewarded more. And so that's one of those things where that is the next step in this whole eventual where things are going, the evolution. I don't know how quickly it's going to be here, but this, 24 team super conference or whatever, where it's just all of the major television brands. But how long does it take to get there? And you're going to have, like what happens when a new OSU president comes in and is like, why are we doing this? Like, why? Or, whomever is somebody in charge is like, why does Ohio State bring in the same amount as Rutgers, as Indiana? We need to revisit this. And then once you start to get other people on board of trustees, they're certainly always an eye on the money aspect of things. And once you start to push the momentum in a way of like, yeah, we should be making more, then it starts to build, and now you have those discussions. And that could be, I think that would be perhaps the eventual downfall of the Big Ten, because at that point, the television contracts are so short in terms of everybody else. Like, the Big Ten's is done in 2030. Like ESPN's 10-year deal is done in 2034. The ACC's 20-year deal is done in 2036. Like, maybe what happens is the Big Ten's next deal goes out to about like 2036 or something like that, and then all heck just breaks loose. And maybe even 2034 with the SEC, where if they start to line up these television contracts, then either depending on your perspective, get extremely worried or extremely excited.
Yeah, and for Ohio State fans, I don't think there's a real terrible downside here, other than college football is very different from what you're used to. Ohio State is not in any danger of getting left behind, no matter what happens in the future of the sport. The teams that should be terrified right now are the Washington States, the Oregon States, some of the, Wake Forest and Iowa State, and schools that don't necessarily have a landing spot if the other stuff kind of goes away. And, look at Iowa State. Iowa State is in-state rivals with Iowa. You think of those as very similar programs. The Big 12's new TV deal was something in the neighborhood of $32 million a year, something like that. Iowa's going to be making double that. And they're the Big Ten number is only going to go up in the future. And the Big 12 is, unless basketball becomes a much bigger draw on TV, that's not necessarily going to go up nearly as much for the Big 12. So you've got Big Ten already way ahead and gaining speed, and the Big 12 kind of puttering along and way far behind. And you're going to get left behind as an Iowa State type program. The idea of the stuff lining up in 2034 or 2036, something like that, I think that is where you're really looking at potentially a significant change in the future. I think I'll be interested to see when you get to the next TV negotiations, the one for the Big Ten deal that ends after 2030. Is that even broached as a subject, unequal revenue distribution, or is that just a is this just sort of status quo there? Because it feels like if the ACC goes to that, and the Pac-12 goes to that, I think you're going to have a hard time not seeing the Big Ten go to that. And the other area you could see unequal revenue distribution is, okay, let's say that the Big 12 does take the four corner schools, like we talked about at the start of the show, and then Washington and Oregon are treading water right now and desperately hoping the Big Ten throws them a life ring, and then the Big Ten can sort of stand on the deck of the ship and say, well, how badly do you want the life ring? And do those schools just get $30 million a year, or they get whatever the additional revenue is in the TV contract that they would bring in, and then they're at a significant disadvantage compared to their conference mates, but maybe, but that is at least a longer term future, and you end up making more money down the line. I mean, that's because if you're in the Pac-12 and you're suddenly the Pac-6 and you add San Diego State and you add SMU, at some point, I mean, are they looking at Boise State at some point? I mean, these are all questions that are, do they look at Fresno State at some point? I mean, these are all questions that are UNLV. This is all, you're getting into sort of cultural fit and academic fit, and all. Again, these are university presidents who have to make these decisions. This is not football coaches or athletic directors making these decisions. But the Pac-12, which is the Pac-6 plus Fresno State, San Diego State, UNLV, and SMU. I mean, that's a real that's like rich man's Mountain West, and at that point, you're just falling further behind.
Yeah, and right now in the final year of the Pac-12 contract, their teams are getting $20 million a year from ESPN and Fox. And if we're talking about the Big Ten or the Big 12 poaching the Pac-12, and the Big 12 is making about $32 million a year per team, obviously the Pac-12 is looking at leaving, the Pac-12 teams looking at leaving don't expect to be making that from the Pac-12. So they're thinking, 25? I mean, you're going to go up a little, maybe not now, losing USC, UCLA. So can you even expect to go up? So if you're saying, well, if we just continue to make $20 million and you're Oregon and Washington, would you gladly take 50, knowing that, 50 from the Big Ten, knowing that that's, 17 million less than other programs for a handful of years, so that you make the Big Ten teams that are already in existence okay with the addition, and you're not taking money out of their wallet that isn't even there, but they have already spent. You're trying to make them happy by taking a little bit. That is much more palatable than Ohio State and Michigan saying, if everybody is in this $67 million average, we should be getting 80, and everybody else should be getting like 64 or something like that. I think you can make you move the money around. I think it's much more palatable to bring in new programs for less money. And then that is because that's also normal, where you don't get the full revenue share. But Maryland and Rutgers didn't get the full revenue share, and Nebraska didn't either. Now, I don't know that it was, you'll have to move it up and down in terms of what actually that money would be. And then, of course, I think it was Maryland maybe took a loan out against their future revenue to be full-fledged, and then they're paying that back as they go. But I think it's safer for the sport as a whole if you bring in new programs for under money, because we've seen that happen before, rather than, because once you get into Ohio State and Michigan saying we want more, then there's a tipping point there.
That feels like the path that leads to, whether it's 2036 or 2045 or whatever. There has always kind of been this idea of the 24-team Super League, and it's just basically the English Premier League, but it's American college football, and it's Georgia and Alabama and Ohio State and Michigan and Texas and Oklahoma and USC and whoever else. That feels like that's the path that leads, is most likely to lead to that. I think virtually everything we're talking about here, I would peg as a little under 50-50 to happen, or significantly under 50-50 to happen. Is the Big 12 going to add those four corner schools? I don't know. I mean, the article made it sound like it was pretty much a coin toss, where if you talk to the Big 12 people, they say yes. If you talk to the Pac-12 people, they say no. So someone is telling the truth, or they both think that, and we're all going to find out together. If that happens, does the Big 10 add Washington and Oregon in the short term? I still think you're probably less than 50-50 on that, because it's not like their negotiating power is going to get, the Big Ten's negotiating position is going to get significantly worse if they wait a year or 2 years. And the Big Ten doesn't have a commissioner right now. So you got to kind of sort of sort that stuff out a little bit. And Washington and Oregon are still going to be there in a year, because Washington and Oregon, are they going to jump to the Big 12, or are they going to, because the Big 12 is not going to make any significantly more money than the Pac-12 is, probably. Maybe minus some of those other schools, maybe they will, but then Washington and Oregon might be getting a more beneficial cut of whatever the Pac-12's TV deal is. So at that point, maybe they hang around for this next TV deal, and then in 6 years, we're revisiting the Washington-Oregon thing.
Yeah, and the Big 12's deal begins in 2025, goes through 2031. So it's like 1 year past the Big Tens. And as you said, the programs that are still out there, or if, wherever Washington and Oregon are, it's not going to be the SEC. So like if the Big Ten wants them, they'll still be there. I still think, and we can start wrapping the show up, but I still think a move south is an interesting one for the Big Ten. Georgia Tech, academically, not regionally, but being in Atlanta, I think would be hilarious and awesome for the Big Ten, frankly. In terms of, any other schools, we say the AAU is very, very important. It didn't seem to be any of importance for Notre Dame. So the Big Ten can say what they want, but they would, they'd toss the AAU requirement aside for a Notre Dame. Would they do that for anybody else? Probably not. But if you do it for one team, then how important is it to you, really, once you're talking about if a program or programs can make you more money, and none of the West Coast programs other than USC or UCLA can make the Big Ten more money. So eventually you just have to come to a decision. Where are we happy in terms of what we lose by adding, what we gain by adding? And I still think the move south is the eventual way to go for the Big Ten, whether it's, you add another West Coast team to give three out there, and then you bring in like three Southern teams. And are we considering Virginia and North Carolina Southern? Maybe when you hear them talk. Mm-hmm. But, I just think that's where things are going. And, I've done mock-ups over, last year of like the Big Ten 24-team league, because I don't think that's out of the realm of possibility either. And I think the SEC will eventually have a 24 team, and that may be your only two leagues. That may be your NFC and your AFC, basically.
Yeah, at that point, you really do have two conferences, and then everyone else is playing just kind of a different level of the sport. And I did want to circle back on your idea that they were going to overlook Notre Dame, overlook the AAU for Notre Dame, and not for that it would matter for a school like Georgia Tech, because those are very much not the same caliber of football programs. Because Georgia Tech has won a New Year's Six bowl game, so I mean, really, very different things we're talking about there. One thing that it was sort of always intriguing to me was you kept hearing about North Carolina in connection with the Big Ten over the years, and I think a lot of that had to do with Jim Delaney, the former Big Ten commissioner, was a North Carolina grad. he is still, you kind of hear that he's still in some sort of a behind-the-scenes advisory role with the Big Ten in some form of it or another. So you wonder if that might factor into that kind of decision, and does that, if he is really still kind of involved in that process, does that maybe lead them a little bit more towards the North Carolina type schools? But right now they're at 16. If you're going to add, if you're going to get to 24, and again, this is purely speculative. This is not anything that we're saying this is going to happen in the next 2 weeks. This is 2040. We're all sitting here, and the 24-team Big Ten is the 16 current teams plus Georgia Tech, Virginia, North Carolina, Duke, Washington, Oregon, Stanford, Cal. I mean, is that? And then the 24-team SEC is the 16 teams there plus Florida State, Miami,
Clemson.
Do they take an NC State? Do they take a Pitt? Do they take you're probably pulling someone else in Texas. I mean, is it TCU at that point? Is it, there's a lot of different directions they could go with that, but whatever happens, if that's how it goes, if this is 24-team conferences, boy, everyone who is outside of that 48 schools is going to be really playing a very different level of football at that point. Because then if you get 24-team conferences, that's where all the TV money is going, because that's a lot of TV inventory. So then, if you're outside of that group, then you have, then it's probably as big or bigger than the current Power 5 versus Group of 5 gap. It's going to be the Power 2 other 8 gap. That might be every bit as big or bigger than the current divide.
Yeah, when you're talking about what would the SEC do, I mean, can they get, the SEC or North Carolina State, Virginia, like the North Carolina schools, the Texas schools like Baylor, Texas Tech, how much does that add? But if you're just trying to keep up with the Big Ten, or the Big Ten is trying to keep up with the SEC, do you concern yourself as much with what is the bigger concern, keeping up or making your programs happy? And we've got a long time before they have to start doing that, because I think the Big Ten is set for a while. They don't need to do anything, but if there are teams out there, if there are schools out there, it's going to be fascinating to see if they're like, you know what, let's just do it. Like a spur of the moment purchase while you're in the checkout. Okay, give me the Snope Digest, that sort of thing.
The Big Ten and Washington and Oregon just going to the little chapel in Vegas, like, oh, what the heck?
Let's do it.
You only live once. Yeah, it's I think if you were giving me, Oregon and Washington are going to join the Big Ten at some point in the future, when is that? And the choices are in the next year, after the next TV deal, or in 2036. I think probably the most likely time to me would be 2030 after the next TV deal. TV deal ends. Presumably the Pac-12's TV deal is ending right around the same time, so you get the grant of rights thing lining up again, and you've had time for things to sort of settle with your current move. The Big Ten has generally not done bing bang boom, like one move and then another move a year later. It was Penn State in 1993, Nebraska in 2011, and then Rutgers and Maryland 3 years later. It feels like they're probably, especially without a conference commissioner right now and some high-profile presidencies turning over, there's no real reason to rush into this. Like, they'll be there. Don't worry. Like, you don't need. This is not like trying to buy a house right now where you have to put in an offer before you walk out the door, or you have no chance. Like, don't worry. Washington and Oregon will still be there, and if they move to the Big 12, guess what? You're still going to be a more attractive option than the Big 12 whenever the Big 12's TV contract's up. So there's no real reason to rush into this right now, and it doesn't feel to me like it's very likely that it's going to happen now, but I've been wrong before.
It'll be interesting to see what the length of that Pac-12 deal is. Like, does it match up with the Big Ten's in terms of it ends in 2030? And then there's also the aspect, and I am trying to wrap the show up. If
you're terrible at this,
I know, believe me, I know. These programs, Oregon, Washington, like Oregon is probably going to be privately funded as much as it is from TV funding, with Nike and Phil Knight. But Washington, if they continue to go these next 5-6 years making $20 million a year, will it be a program? Will it be a program that the Big Ten wants or needs? Certainly not needs, but is there a danger of these programs dwindling to something that you wouldn't even want in 6 years? And then the next question is like, so what if it is? Like, is that a bad, how does that bother you? How does that impact you?
I don't think it does. I don't think that getting into the Pacific Northwest is an absolute must for the Big Ten. And, if it happens, it happens, and that's fine. But no one is going to live or die with that coveted Portland TV market. Like, sure, if you get it, that's fine. But that's not adding New York. That's not adding Chicago. That's not adding Houston or, the Philadelphia. It's fine. But if you don't get it, then you just go and do the Southeast, the ACC thing that we talked about earlier. And that's, I think, perfectly fine too. I think there might almost be a benefit to waiting to see USC and UCLA. Is it a big problem that they are kind of out on an island by themselves? And if so, okay, then maybe that helps make the decision in 5 years, 6 years when you're circling back to this kind of conversation. But, to your point with the Ryan Day thing, where you kind of want to let things settle down for a little while and sort of take a deep breath and see where things are. Okay, let's see what the college football landscape looks like in a couple of years once the NIL stuff is settled, once the conference realignment stuff is settled, once the 12-team playoff thing has sort of settled. Take a deep breath, take a stock of the situation, and then you can figure out, do we really need to add those 2 Pacific Northwest schools for travel purposes, or, those 2 plus the Bay Area schools? For travel purposes, will that make everyone's life a lot easier for scheduling purposes? Or is that not really necessary and we can, you can just live with adding from whoever from the ACC or whoever else?
Boy, it seems like such a small world in such a short time ago, where getting programs some more Eastern programs for Penn State, and that took 20 years for the Big Ten really to move forward with that. But we'll add Maryland and Rutgers. That way there's more programs around you. And you look at how spread out the Big Ten is now, and it's like, boy, you guys are really babies. The Penn State whiners, we need more people close to us. Like, look at the Big Ten. Look at, you've got plenty of elbow room, and it's going to continue to change. But I'm with you, Tom. I think you've got everything signed. Everything is. Now, if Notre Dame comes to you tomorrow, that's one thing. None of these programs in Notre Dame, I don't think you have to act, because where are the West Coast teams going to go other than somewhere on the West Coast? And they'll be there waiting for you. So I'm with you there. Anything else before? And this was going to be like a car conversation show. Basically, this is what we talk about on road trips, sort of like that. And just, so there really no, structure or anything, Tom. So did you have anything else before? I'm trying to go.
I know you're trying to go, but we do need to touch on Notre Dame a little bit, because Notre Dame is sort of the exception, as you said, the exception to the rule on all of this stuff, where if Notre Dame came to them, and Notre Dame is not going to come to them tomorrow and say, we want to join a conference. Notre Dame has, I believe, just signed a new TV deal, or is in the process of signing a new TV deal for a lot more money. But they are the kind of the weird exception to the rule, where they're willing to sacrifice a certain amount of money to maintain that football independence. What would really change that would be if the ACC explodes at some point, and that's where you really get the seismic shift. Where if the ACC explodes and the Big Ten takes, the couple of the Carolina schools or whatever, and Georgia Tech, and the SEC takes a couple of the others, and then Notre Dame doesn't have a place to stash all of their other sports, at that point, that probably is where that potentially changes for them. So that's, again, probably a mid-2030s conversation, much more than a next 2 week conversation. But that's I think the one thing that, if you're going to have like the massive shift in college football to the 2 power conferences, that's probably something that's happening around that time. One
last thing, your good buddy Kevin Noon, who's been out and about he's been out and about, and it was at the combine, and it was somewhere else, some other camps in the past week, mentioned on the message board, the Buckeye Huddle message board, that he talked to somebody saying Clemson had been looking at applying for AAU membership and what that would require. So, Tom, keep that in mind. Clemson to the Big Ten.
I mean, it would be a fascinating cultural fit, boy. I mean, it would be great football stuff. You know, there are also other reasons other than joining the Big Ten that a university might want to join the AAU. Mm-hmm. There's literally billions of research dollars that flow through there. So, you know, that's probably not a purely football move, but it does. I mean, if they are given that, if they're granted that at some point, and that is also not a 2-week process to apply there. I'm going to guess that is you're going to apply there and you might hear back in 4 years kind of deal. But that's something that would certainly maybe change the conversation a little bit. Then again, around who's a Big Ten team, who is a SEC team when all of that shakes out. Because would South Carolina want Clemson in the SEC? Would Georgia want Clemson in the SEC? I don't know that they would, but Texas A&M didn't want Texas in the SEC, and we see how well that worked out. So none of this may end up mattering in the end, but it sure is fun to think about.
I think Clemson's mom and dad are like, why don't you also think of a fallback association that you can belong to instead? You know, something like that. Maybe a South Carolina association, something like that.
The Association of American Safety Schools.
Exactly. Perfect. That will do it for this episode. Want to thank you all for tuning in. As always, please find us at BuckeyeHuddle.com. Become a member. Say hello to us there on the message board. Also, continue to watch us at YouTube.com/BuckeyeHuddle. Hit the thumbs up. Hit the bell to be notified. If you're listening to this via your podcast platform of choice, specifically Apple or Spotify, reviews and ratings, 5-star ratings and reviews always do us wonders. So if you have time, 15, 20 minutes, that's all it would take to really pour out your heart and your soul on what this show means to you. So anything you can do, we do appreciate it, especially just listening like you are right now and watching. Thank you very much. We'll talk to you guys later.